Okay, I think we're about ready to get started. So welcome everyone to the first webinar presented by the Journal of Mass Violence Research. It's been just over a year since we created and kind of launched the journal, and we appreciate the contributions of all the various authors and the editorial board. When Jackie and I initially discussed the need for the journal last year, we envisioned kind of an open access resource to share rigorous research related to these various facets of mass violence, both in the United States and abroad. As we have unfortunately seen, the need for such research and applications of this work are still necessary. So we want to start first with a moment of silence for the victims of mass violence and the communities that have been devastated by such attacks, including Buffalo, Uvalde, Highland Park, and most recently, the child care facility in Thailand. Okay, so thank you. This webinar is based on the articles included in our recently published special issue related to definitional issues in gun violence. Jackie and I wanted to reflect on the 10 years since Sandy Hook, Aurora, and Oak Creek, as well as the tragedy since then. And the authors of the articles, many of whom are with us today for this webinar, have generously offered their insights about how we define and study active and mass shooting events. The special issue with the articles is available on the website, and Jackie can post that in the chat for all of us. We hope that the special issue and the webinar today can encourage further discourse and respectful debate about terminology in this field, and hopefully bring us one step closer to preventing mass violence. So with us today, we have authors from 3 of the 4 articles put forth in the special issue. First, we'll hear from Dr. William Sandel, followed by Dr. James Allen Fox, and then closing out with Dr. Emily Greene-Colozzi and Dr. Jason Silva. Unfortunately, Dr. Eric Madfis was selected for jury duty, so he won't be able to join us, but we encourage everyone to check out the articles available at jmvr.org. We'll invite the panelists to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes to share a summary of their article, and then we'll invite discussion and questions from the audience, which you can share in the Q&A section on your screen. So without further ado, we'll turn to Dr. Sandel to get us started.
Hi, thank you all for having me here today for this. Just to give a little introduction about me, I'm Dr. Bill Sandel at Missouri State University. My colleague, Dr. Hunter Martindale, who's the Director of Research at the Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response Training Center, or the ALERT Center, which is the national standard for active shooter training and response. He could not be here today. He's traveling home from a conference. But our research primarily focuses on active shooter events. And in fact, both of us are voting members of the FBI's active shooter working group for determining cases that get put on the FBI's active shooter list. And so we come up against these definitional differences all the time. And our paper really focuses more on not necessarily trying to present a new and innovative definition for mass shootings or mass violence, but is really trying to more concretely establish the definitions that are currently out there being used. Many of these definitions have overlap, and because of that, there's quite a lot of confusion when a lot of these definitions are presented, whether it be in academia or in police reports or the media. And because of that, it's really difficult to actually get good numbers on this information. And a lot of that is because of the overlap that occurs. You can absolutely have an active shooter event where it is a mass murder and a mass shooting. And you can also have an active shooter event where not a single person was actually shot. There have been cases where a shooter goes in and is actively trying to commit mass murder, but doesn't actually get to shoot anybody, and it's still an active shooter event. And it's really important to understand these different definitions. One, because the data that we provide to the public, there needs to be a real concrete understanding of what that data is, where it comes from, and how it's being defined. And that's been one of the biggest struggles that I think we see as academics. You hear people talking about active shooter events that only have 3 or more people shot. Well, that's not necessarily an active shooter event. So when it comes to this confusion, we really tried to lay out in our paper federal definitions that have been provided through legal standards, or definitions that are just widely held and produced by the federal government, by the FBI, something like that. So when we look at mass murder, we present the old definition of 4 or more people killed, and then the newer definition from the IABCA that was 3 or more people killed. And then when it comes to mass shooting, because it's never been specifically federally defined, we just make that logical next step, connecting the mass murder definition to a mass shooting definition, so 3 or more people shot. When it comes to the active shooter events, that's been federally defined by the FBI as an individual actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a confined and populated area. The way we try to really talk about an active shooter event is somebody actively attempting to commit mass murder. And once again, they don't actually have to hit those minimum thresholds for it to be an active shooter event, but it's somebody actively trying to do that. It's not somebody coming in who's specifically targeting 1 or 2 people, shooting them and leaving. There's no real active component to that. That's more of a homicide, double homicide. And then we've even recently broadened it to be an active attack, because oftentimes law enforcement are responding and training for these types of scenarios, regardless of if it's a gun or not. It may be a knife, it may be a vehicle. And so being able to include more of those weapons that are being used became very important. So there's been this shift to more of an active attack event. And a lot of these, and especially the big ones that we hear about, are mass murders or are mass shootings, and they have those minimum number thresholds that get hit. But a lot of them that we would really exclude, that a lot of people talk about in the same realm of active shooter events and mass murder, are things like gang violence. Gang violence is a specific type of targeted violence that we typically exclude, because there's not specific targeting of the general public often. That being said, there can be spillover. And when the general public starts being targeted at the end of some targeted gang shooting, then it spills over into active shooter. And of course, if it meets those minimum thresholds, it can be a mass killing or a mass shooting. So like I said, our definition piece is really focusing in just on providing the definitions that are currently out there from more of that federal government level, so we can really start better presenting the information as academics, as mass media to the general public, as law enforcement, to better understand these events and better understand how to respond to them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bill, for those insights. That was a really good overview of kind of the issues that we're dealing with. So now we invite Dr. Fox to provide an overview of his paper.
No, now you can hear me, correct?
Yep,
Can
we
you hear
got
me?
you.
Okay, thank you. I do have slides. Anyway, as it says, James Fox and Emma Friedel and I worked on this together. By the way, I go by Jamie, so you don't have to be formal with me. I guess as background, I've been studying this topic since the early 1980s, when very few people were, just about 4 of us in the field. It's a lot more crowded now. The research literature has just ballooned. Anyway, I am here to talk about definitions, of course, and why is this not working? There we go. The definition that I prefer, as you'll see, is one that's decades old, since the early 1980s at least. That's when Jack Levitt and I did our first book, starting in '82, as well as the FBI back then defining it as a mass shooting, as 4 more people killed by gunfire. I'll talk about more other weapons later. And I'm presenting this here as a database that I work on. It's the Associated Press, USA Today, Northeastern University database, which goes back to 2006. The concern is when you go back much further than that, there is a possibility of missing cases. I know that was an issue with the early reports from the FBI about active shooter events, where there were some missing cases from the early years. And it's also been the case with some other data sets. So we went back, only go back to 2006. I feel fairly confident we have all the cases. By the way, the data is available. It's an online website and a public data set you can download that has about 4 dozen variables. There really hasn't been much of a change in the past 15 years, indeed this century, in terms of number of cases. There has been an increase compared to, say, the 1980s. So in the long term, yes. In the shorter term, no increase in number of cases. The red here are the ones that people really worry about, the public mass killings, schools, churches, restaurants, etc. They are a small proportion of all mass shootings. In fact, the most we've ever had in any given year is 10. The average about 6. The others, of course, are family massacres, which make up about 45%, as well as gang-related, drug-related, and various other. There has been an increase in the severity over the past few years, but that's largely attributable just to a handful of cases. For example, if you look at mass shootings with at least 20 killed, there have been 9 in our history, and 5 of them occurred since 2006. Now, that said, in 2012, when everybody started getting interested in mass shooting, both the public and the press and the academic community, they were looking for data sets and databases, and a variety of organizations, including USA Today, started building their own. Well, the Gun Violence Archive and a few others basically said, well, there's nothing in the word mass shooting that requires someone die. Death is not in the phrase. So they define it as 4 or more people shot, whether they're killed or injured. And unfortunately, this contributed to some confusion. Look, for example, at this graphic that CBS News put, and at that point, there have been more mass shootings than days of this year. Scary concept. And all the examples they give in this graphic are deadly mass killings, that some of the deadliest ones. It's very easy for people to get confused when you start talking about hundreds a year, and then all the examples you give are ones with lots of deaths. You'd think the New York Times would do it better. In the aftermath of a mass shooting, the press often likes to quote the Gun Violence Archive because they're talking about hundreds of cases. Last year, over 600. Now, New York Times, and that's where the confusion comes in by conflating the two. New York Times, after a mass shooting May of last year, had this article, partial list of mass shootings in the US this year, 2021. And this list on the left is every single mass killing with at least 4 people dead. It's all of them of that year at that point. But in the article, they said this is an incomplete list of shootings. There's many, many more. Well, they don't say that the many more are very different in severity. They let the reader get confused and misled into thinking that the many more are just like these 13. Death is different. And I think the Gun Violence Archive database is valuable, but it also can be misunderstood. The death is different because, first of all, there's no gradations of death. You're either dead or you're not. Well, there are gradations of injury. Injuries can be severe, debilitating, lifelong effects, or they can be very minor. Now, injury should be counted, but as you'll see soon, not combined with fatalities. Some people say, well, wait a minute, intent to kill it could have been, well, coulda, shoulda, woulda, it's not a mass killing. What matters is that whether the victims die or don't die. When you think about what would have happened, for example, if the Uvalde victims had survived, if they all lived, well, it would have been different. There've been no funerals and no memorials. There wouldn't be flowers and teddy bears at the crime scene. You wouldn't have the same level of media coverage, and we wouldn't have a federal gun law that was inspired by the Uvalde shooting. And by the way, if you look at on the right side, less than 5% of the gun violence archive mass shootings are mass killings. And on average, 1 death per case. Half of the mass shootings in the gun violence archive, no one's killed. And 3/4 of them, 0 or 1 death. So if people hear mass shootings, they think Uvalde, Las Vegas, but if you're talking about the gun violence archive data, most of them are not anywhere near that. Also, you shouldn't be combining assailant deaths with victim deaths. Several databases, including the gun violence archive, have a count of how many people are killed. Now, I've circled, for example, 2 cases where the death tolls include the offender either committing suicide or being killed by the police. So there were 21 victims at Uvalde, not 22. By the way, they also have the wrong number of victims for Highland Park. There were 7. And people look at this and they think they get the wrong idea about what the victim count was. They could include it, but don't combine it with the number killed, or at least put an asterisk and say one of these is the perpetrator. So our preferred definition is here. This is the definition that we use with the mass killing, the USA Today Northeastern AP database. We include mass killings 4 or more. Again, the traditional definition going back decades. No matter how or where or why or whatever, these victims are killed. You know, if you're killed by a family member, you're just as dead. If you're killed in a robbery, you're just as dead. I know that when people hear mass shootings, they think of public events. Those are the scariest because they can happen at any time to anyone, anywhere. But they are a small percentage of all the cases. So we do include all cases of mass shootings, no matter where location, victim-offender relationship, et cetera. And I'll put in also a plug for the fact that we also include non-shooting mass killings. In fact, of the 513 mass killings in the databases 2006, nearly 100 are non-shooting. So about 80% of mass killings are shootings. But if you die as a result of a stabbing, strangulation, bludgeoning, actually those victims oftentimes suffer even more than a gunshot victim. So we shouldn't ignore those cases just because they don't bring up the issue of gun control. So, but that issue about whether we should also study mass killings and not focus so much on guns, that's for another day. So I appreciate your attention and hand it back to Jackie and Sarah. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Fox. We appreciate your contribution to the special issue. So next we'll head over to Drs. Greene-Colozzi and Silva, if you want to share a summary of your proposal of your article.
Sure, thank you. I'll start. I can give a little intro to myself and Dr. Silva. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself as well. I'm Emily Greene-Colozzi. I'm an assistant professor at University of Massachusetts Lowell. And I'm going to be talking about our spiels. So before I do, Jay, do you want to?
I'm Dr. Jason Silva from William Patterson University. Emily is going to take over on summarizing our article for you today. So thank you, Emily.
Thanks. So thank you again for inviting us and for having this event. I think this is such an important topic. And from what I've heard from the other panelists, it seems that a thread that links these papers and presentations is really trying to get clarity, reduction of confusion for everybody, not just academics, but the general public. So we're going to be, or I'm going to be echoing some of my co-panelists' sentiments about addressing the overload of definitions that are currently out there. But the definition that Dr. Silva and I propose pivots a little bit away from the outcome-specific restrictions to being included in a database. So we define a public mass shooting as an incident of gun violence or an intended incident that's been planned or perpetrated by at least one offender in a public populated location during the time span of a day. And in terms of our victim criterion, we are really focused on the behavior of the perpetrator more so than the completedness of the shooting. As such, we actually are proposing a zero victim casualty definition. And by that, we mean 0 gunshot wounds are necessary to be included in the data set. And importantly, our definition really focuses in on the mass intent of the shooting. And this is critical for all of the cases, but most especially cases where there are fewer than 4 fatalities. We want to see evidence of mass intent. And we suggest that this definition has some benefits for academia as well as public media understanding, because it includes all public mass shooting outcomes and lets us understand important insights about harm mitigation, interventional strategies, and prevention, which we're not necessarily getting if we're really only focusing on one specific outcome, which is a completed 4 or more fatality mass shooting. And we also think that having this definition that very broadly defines the phenomenon allows us to filter out cases if we would like to only study specific types of mass shootings. So if we only want to look at completed mass shootings, we do have that data. If we only want to look at and describe the prevalence of attempted mass shootings that didn't reach that 4 or more fatality threshold, we're still capturing that data. So it's an overabundance of data instead of a very restricted definition. And most importantly for us is this opportunity to perform comparative analyses among the different outcomes to understand how and why some attacks are completed and some attacks are failed or are thwarted. So to reiterate, we're most interested in those cases where the perpetrator demonstrates a specific motive to commit random predatory act of public mass violence. And we propose 4 categories encompassed within our overall definition. A completed mass shooting, which is an incident that involves 4 or more fatalities, excluding the perpetrator. A attempted mass shooting, which is an incident with fewer than 4 deaths, but at least 1 gunshot casualty, which could be an injury or a fatality. A failed mass shooting, which would be an incident that involves 0 victim casualties, but a perpetrator who arrives at their intended target with a firearm and shows behavioral evidence of trying to carry out that public mass shooting. And then finally, foiled public mass shootings. So planned incidents with 0 victim casualties that didn't progress beyond the planning stage. So the incident was set into motion, the perpetrator maybe started gathering weapons, making plans, drawing diagrams, selecting a target, but they were thwarted before they could actually arrive at the target. So we believe that these 4 categories are really critical if we're aiming to do inferential comparative research, if we're aiming to understand policy relevant prevention and intervention strategies. So if we're trying to understand how to prevent a public mass shooting, it's necessary to look at both cases where the mass shooting was thwarted and cases where it was actually completed to get that the differentiation between the behaviors that were the perpetrator engaged in, who noticed the behaviors, why did it fail exactly? In essence, we have to understand failure, and understanding failure means that we're not just looking at completed incidents. And I want to note that the points that Dr. Fox was making about the importance of having a good understanding of the prevalence and reducing this mass confusion is such a critical one. And it's so important that we're not overstating the phenomenon. And to that end, we again feel that with our definition, we're still retaining the ability to look at completed 4+ fatality mass shootings. And our definition does focus specifically on mass shootings instead of mass killings. So it's a little bit different, and we further narrow it to public mass shootings. So it's a very specific, yet broadly defined type of public mass shooting. But with this, we would still be able to engage in descriptive research to understand the prevalence, particularly violent locations, particularly violent years, in order to reduce some of that confusion about what's an active shooter incident, what's a mass shooting, a public mass shooting. If we can really sort of use these categories, we can keep clear differentiation based on the outcome of the incident. And of course, for inferential research, the comparison groups are so important for informing policies related to prevention, intervention, and harm mitigation. And to this end, we suggest that scholars who want to use this definition could put into effect a measurement system for coding mass intent. And in our paper, we propose a strategy for doing that. It's a very preliminary strategy. As far as we know, we're sort of among the first to suggest looking at the perpetrator's behavior and intimating mass intent from that. But these indicators that we suggest include things like crime scene behavior. So a perpetrator who aims at specific victims, roams throughout the space, hunts for victims, returned several times to shoot injured victims, has a known grievance against the location, and then also pre-incident planning or preparatory behaviors like obtaining guns, stockpiling ammunition, engaging in training, going to gun ranges, and any other warning signs that have been established in the pathway to violence literature. Jay, do you want to add anything?
No, I'll wait for the questions and stuff.
Okay, I think that's broadly our definition in a nutshell. So thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Greene-Colozzi. That was really informative. So Dr. Matvis and Dr. Hawes have kind of also offered a comprehensive model for rampage violence. So if people are interested, they can also check this out on the JMVR website. So now we'll open it up for discussion. We invite the audience here to submit questions through the Q&A, and Jackie will monitor it. But while we wait for questions, if there are any, we strongly encourage you to do so. I'll ask the panelists if they have anything to add or to comment based on the other presentations, because I think without this being contentious, I think we have differences of opinion here. So if you kind of want to talk amongst yourselves or ask questions, we can do that while we're waiting for questions from everybody else. Yeah, Jamie, go ahead.
Jamie, you're muted.
There we are. I applaud the efforts to try to broaden the definitions. My only concern is in terms of collecting data prospectively or retrospectively. When you have definitions that include very low levels of harm, maybe even no harm, they're very hard to find, particularly if you're going back years. I mean, that was one of the problems with the FBI's active shooter reports, or at least the original ones, where, for example, in 2000, they said there's only one active shooter event, which was a mass killing in Massachusetts, but it's unfathomable that there were none other in the entire country, that no one picked up a gun and wanted to kill lots of people, even though they didn't even shoot the gun. So the problem is missing data. And I also wonder, and I really appreciate Emily and Jason, your effort there too, to broaden into even events that are attempted, is same thing, the missing data issue, that it's hard to find these cases if no one's killed. It's even harder to find if no one's even injured. You're relying on media reports, and so you may get sort of a distortion based on region. And I've seen that with other research that use, for example, the New York Times, where there's a higher percentage of cases are from the Northeast. So it's very difficult. And I just wonder how you're going to deal with that. I don't know how far back you're going, or if at all.
So I'm happy to respond to this. Jamie, nice to meet you. We've never actually met before. Obviously, I'm a big fan of your work.
Same
So
here.
in terms of the missing data, I think that maybe like the root of this question is the idea of like counting each year and how many instances occur each year, which is something that you have done a great job of, especially with sort of breaking down media issues with that. And we agree with you in that sense. So we agree that when it comes to the media's reporting of public mass shootings, they should, first of all, historically, the issue was they should report the public mass shootings if that's what they're interested in, as a lot of the media coverage is focused on. And those numbers are going to be much easier to capture because if there's 4 deaths, it's likely going to be reported. So when it comes to this reporting, I think that we should focus on the completed mass shootings. The thing that we're trying to do is break down what you had done and what like became very popular with Krause and Richardson's congressional research report, where they broke down the public, felony, and family mass shootings. We're now trying to help with the confusion surrounding instances involving less than 4 or more fatalities, and how we can categorically analyze those issues by giving them titles. And then in future media coverage, they could say, these are public mass shootings that have been completed, right? So focusing on not just the public, but also the completed element to provide more clarity in the media. So with that in mind, with that captured, I think when it comes to the missing material, yes, there's going to be more attempted, failed, and foiled mass shootings that are missing. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't analyze these problems, because we know we can gain so much insight from looking at, in particular, the failed and foiled mass shootings, and determining how they were failed and foiled is going to provide prevention efforts in the future, as well as intervention efforts.
So it's more about differences than it is about trend.
But yes, and I think that the trend element is something that you do a lot in your research, but we're more interested in not necessarily promoting the attempted, failed, and foiled in trends in the media. I don't think that that is going to help too much. Instead, I think what we're going to do is say, if, for example, you were talking about the problems with the gun violence archive, if we were able to then say these ones were completed, these ones were attempted based on our criteria, I think using this new language that we're offering is going to offer a lot more clarity to the public.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I might add, the issues with identifying cases and missing data is also so important. It's something we all have to engage in when we're doing this kind of research for exactly the same reasons that you outlined, Jamie. And I think, as Jay said, it's not something that we can easily address looking retrospectively, because there is going to be much less media coverage of older cases. This was something that, I recently defended my dissertation, and that was one of the big questions that my committee had for me based on my definition was, how are you justifying looking at the sample when, back in the 1960s, there just wasn't this type of coverage of public mass shootings. How are you capturing zero casualty shootings? So it's definitely an ongoing issue. And I think one other important thing to note about that is the crucial nature of improving open source methodology kind of across the board, but especially for studying public mass shootings. We're all well aware of all the databases that are out there and the varying levels of reliability and validity that they have. Some databases don't at all talk about missing data, and we all know that there's going to be missing data no matter how great your searches are. If you're using media coverage, it's always going to be missing data. So I think engaging in these issues actively while doing the research and reporting on them and making sure that the methodology issues are highlighted as much as the conceptual issues and the interesting, fascinating results we're finding is going to be a big step in helping to reduce some of these the media biases that happen with longer time periods.
That's great. Thank you. Bill, I hate to put you on the spot here, but I think some of the discussion about this, about missing data, and there's been, kind of ongoing debates about the FBI active shooter report. So if you would want to weigh in just kind of about that from your perspective and experience?
Yeah, definitely. So, the FBI has done its best, obviously, to do these searches. I mean, they have analysts that work their entire careers doing searches for this stuff, as well as the alert team. And the FBI has released supplemental reports that have gone back and added cases to the original data set that were missing. And it doesn't happen too frequently, but nor do these FBI publications on the active shooter events. I can tell you, as being a member of it, it's a lot of work to get all this together, to gather the events, vote on the events, do all the adjudication involved, collect the police reports to see what's actually going on versus what the media said. And so, they are steadily updating those that are there. Oftentimes, I think when events get sent in that somebody thinks are missing, oftentimes it doesn't quite meet the definition of an active shooter event. And what the most missing element tends to be is the actual active component. And that's where I think active shooter and mass shooting and mass murder really get messy. So if a guy, does an interview, doesn't get the job, goes out to his truck, walks in and kills the 3 people that were interviewing him, well, it's a mass shooting according to our 3 or more, based on the mass killing definition, but not necessarily an active shooter event. If he's walking by everyone else in the office just to go shoot these 3 people and then leave, it's not an active shooter event. It may sound like it on the, 3 people shot in an office. It sounds like it might be, but it isn't necessarily an event that would qualify. Now, certainly there are missing cases. Nobody's perfect. I mean, like I said, we have teams of people looking at this stuff, and we're never going to get it all right. But what we really see is that it's not worth not doing it because we might have some missing data, right? Because that's, in that case, no criminal justice research would really exist at all, because it's so impossible to get every little thing ever. I mean, let's talk about the number of immigrants that are killed that aren't reported, and who knows what kind of situation. I mean, it'd be impossible to actually get every single one of these unless we had some perfect definition that was federally held across the board. Every police department had to report into it, every event that qualified, and that's just not what we have. So it is a lot of combing through media sources and still getting cases in. And I just went through for the active attack and added a case back from 2006 that a retired FBI agent sent us from the state that he was working in. And there was a vehicle attack in North Carolina. It was something we had never come across, but his local expertise and his being there when it happened, he was able to get us that information. It's one we've never found going across the media searches for it. It's impossible to get through all the media with how many. I mean, we would have to have tens of thousands of people doing that, right? But it's all about moving towards what we can establish with a clear definition and have a clear data set that matches that definition, and what can we learn from it. A lot of what the lessons learned from the FBI's active shooter data is more of how can we help officers respond to these events. We'd love to get prevention stuff out there, but a big goal is how can we get officers to respond to these events, to stop these killings faster, and to save the people that have then been shot faster, right? So it's much more of a reactionary outcome that we're hoping for, because it's very difficult to analyze a lot of this stuff post hoc and say, oh, there was a mental problem or whatever else it may be. So yeah, it's very messy, but I think all the panelists agree, absolutely worth doing.
Bill, it is absolutely worth doing. My concern is this idea of retrospective data collection of low severity events. And in terms of the active shooter data, and I know that in the most recent report they've added some more from the past, but for the first 5 years of the data set, from 2000 2004, prior to this most recent update, 7% of the incidents had no one killed. And in the 5 years where the data were being collected concurrently, 2013 to 2018, it was 37% had no one killed. Now, some of the change may have to do with improved police response, but some of the effect is it's just hard to find cases where no one was killed when you go way back. And the problem is that the FBI did promote this trend of 3 times, tripling over those years. And it was carried by the media. It was carried by the Attorney General. Holder talked about it. So I think it's valuable data. I just worry about making comparisons over time when you have a very low threshold. Oh, in terms of threshold, one other thing I'm going to mention is the idea of changing the threshold. For example, Mother Jones originally had 4 or more killed in a public event, and then after the federal legislation in 2013, which arbitrarily said mass shootings would be 3 or more, they switched. But they didn't go back in time. They didn't backfill the old cases. I've seen many instances of people who've used their data and just missed the note that says, we've changed the definition. And they cite a much sharper increase than there actually is, because the fact that now there's 3 of them, there's a lot of cases with 3 people killed. And prior to 2013, they weren't in there. So longitudinal trend stuff gets publicized a lot in the media. We just have to be very careful to make sure those trends are valid. In terms of public mass killings, with, for example, the Violence Project data or the Bill Krause's data, I feel very confident because those cases are easy to find. 4 people killed in a public place, easy to find. It's the other ones that are not.
Yeah, and I think we could probably discuss this about media representation, right? And kind of the conflating of these 2 terms, active shooter, mass shooter, which has happened pretty often with the mass shooting or with the reporting on the active shooter reports from the FBI. But I think along these same lines, Bill, Jason Armstrong in the audience has a question about the active shooter report. And he says that the FBI active shooter report is good at stating what sources the team consult, right? Police reports, news reports that you mentioned to create it. But what does the team use to kind of like cue them up, to tip them off to a specific shooting incident? So as Jason says, given that guns are fired in anger, tens of thousands times per year, I'm sure the FBI doesn't look at every report of gunfire. So you mentioned that one instance, but if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, so it is shocking how many cases we go through that don't qualify or don't even come close to qualifying, but just to try to make sure that they don't qualify, right? So the FBI Active Shooter Working Group is made up of multiple units within the FBI, and then there are specific analysts that work on the active shooter team to specifically go through cases. I go through cases, my GA goes through cases, Dr. Martindale goes through cases, his doctoral students and master students go through cases. So, I mean, there are tons of people looking all the time through a lot of these. And it is a lot of trying to follow the definition. There are some very clear exclusion criteria, and then getting the cases that may be on the edge or should definitely qualify together. And then we go over them as a team and discuss whether it should qualify or not. The FBI has a fellow that works specifically on getting the police reports from the local departments for those incidents. Doesn't always happen, but does happen a lot of the time. So it is, I mean, it's truly, I can't imagine. In a year, I would say we come through thousands of cases individually to try to come at this in a group effort. And once again, we still, of course, miss cases all the time. And, maintaining the active attack data set with the alert center broadens it even more. And, talking about people that aren't injured when a gun is fired, you hear about them even less when it's a knife involved or a vehicle. And now you're really trying to look at intent. Did they accidentally swerve off the road? Did they specifically swerve off the road to try to hit everybody they could, but just missed? I mean, it's tough. It's very tough. But we try to look at every case we can, and there are a lot that just have like like I said, really easy exclusion criteria that we can kick out and not worry about. But yeah, we go through a lot of cases a year, and just knowing that it's not perfect, but regardless of what it is, there is so much we have learned from gathering that data. And with Columbine being the real defining event for an active shooter event, and that happening in '99 and the data starting in 2000, I think it's produced a lot of really good results in better understanding these events and better understanding how to respond to them. Like I said, a lot of it is how can we better respond to these, not necessarily, obviously trend stuff gets posted because they run statistics and then the media goes crazy with whatever they want to go crazy with. But for us, it's really how can we make these terrible events end in a better way with police response. And that's truly where our research comes from.
Yeah, and we appreciate the work that you and the working group are doing, because that sounds like a really tedious task, to say the least. But absolutely, like you said, very important. So I guess that leads to kind of another question, kind of specifically what you said. So someone in the audience, Greg Norton, who's a former student of mine. Hi, Greg. And I'm so proud he's here. But he's asking, once a definition can be agreed on, so let's say we could all sing Kumbaya and we agree on a definition today and we go forth, and all the information, the data is gathered, and let's say it's accurate and we get all the cases. What steps can be taken to prevent these events? Then strong data is important, but what should be done for boots on the ground, as he says, or how can we work with law enforcement agencies and other agencies to apply this? So we'll open that up to everybody.
Well, I'll say something. I think the work on the foiled and averted cases, of course, I think that's critical. I mean, that's really where you look at what differentiates a case where no one was injured at all versus the ones where everybody looks back and say, gee, I missed all those red flags. So that's I think those research efforts, unlike mine, I don't think, just looking at the couple dozen cases a year, lots of people killed, those are really hard to identify prevention from the data. But from the data that Jason and Emily are collecting, I think you can learn a lot about what to do in terms of prevention, how to figure out what steps are necessary to avert or foil.
And just expanding on that, I think with the foiled and failed stuff that Emily and I have been doing, we found that with the foiled cases, those who never reach their intended target and they're foiled before they have that opportunity to reach the intended target, the large majority of them are stopped via leakage. So they told someone about their intentions, and then the person who they told went through the proper channels to avert this attack. And we find that leakage occurs with a lot of completed mass shootings. So the fact that we're able to identify as leakage as being a successful way to foil these attacks, and leakage being so common in the completed attacks, suggests that we should be using strategies for identifying warning signs and leakage as one of the most effective means of avoiding them ever even reaching the intended target.
But since not all leakages lead to intervention prior to the event, what about a leakage? What characteristics of the leakage? What characters of what the person says to friends or writes into notes or whatever are more likely to get recognized by someone and referred to authorities versus those that people say, oh, just talking. He's just blowing off steam. That's the question. What I understand leakage is very common.
Yeah, I think, I'm sorry.
But what leakage is ignored, and what about a leakage is taken seriously?
Jay, you might, I don't know if you have specific
Go ahead.
research.
You look like you want to say.
I was just going to say, I don't know that we have that answer yet. And somebody definitely
will.
correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's a very open avenue for research that we need to focus on, because obviously prevention is the gold standard that we're all aiming for. We don't want to victimize anyone, even by experiencing a failed mass shooting. Like, we want them to totally stop, not necessarily just be intervened. So I'm not sure that I've come across much research that really takes apart leakage and looks at the factors that influence if it's reported, what kinds of behaviors and statements are considered concerning, and who's doing the reporting. I think that's a huge gap in the literature right now, and answering that, I think, will really, really help us understand how to use leakage and how to educate the public, and especially schools and young people about what they should be worried about versus what might just be normal juvenile
But
behavior.
beyond leakage, what other factors? I mean, this
Mhm.
security, so physical security, for example. We assume
Right.
that some sites were able to ward off an event because of the nature of security, and others no. Are you looking at that as well?
Yeah, so I've done a bit of research on that. And again, it's preliminary, and some of my research has suggested that there are elements of the physical environment that can help mitigate the harm. And obviously this doesn't inform us about prevention. It doesn't inform us about reducing the numbers, but in the event that these incidents do occur, I study situational crime prevention, and at sites where there's more situational crime prevention, and especially lockdowns, actually there end up being fewer casualties across all measurements of casualties. So fatalities, injuries and fatalities, number of people pronounced dead at the scene. So I think that that's another area of exploration that we can continue to look at. And it needs to be, replicated, it needs to be tested and across different data sets, obviously. But yeah, I think that, in my own research, lockdowns and certain elements of physical security can have a mitigating impact on the casualty counts. And obviously, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. I thought you were done. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, obviously, it's very location specific. So, schools, there's going to be a different paradigm, a different structure of physical security as compared to malls or restaurants.
I was just saying, I know that the folks at Michigan State have done some interesting work on the physical environment of schools that allow for easy escape, for example, or make it much more difficult for an active shooter to make his way through the building.
Yeah, something as simple as a locked door, could have a really, really huge effect on casualties, which we've seen anecdotally in cases.
Well, locked doors have also some downsides. I mean,
of course,
usually
right?
They weren't locked, and what's the most likely thing to happen if a classroom door is locked is that some 17-year-old boy will push a 14-year-old girl inside, and while she's screaming for help, while he's sexually assaulting her, that no one has the key. There are a lot of we never really did lock classrooms. In my university, classrooms aren't locked. There's a downside of locking classrooms that people oftentimes don't think about. Even the fact that if there is an active shooter, anybody caught in the hallways may find it hard to get into a classroom if they're all locked.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's risks to always risks to situational crime prevention, unintended consequences that have to be considered in the entire equation. Definitely.
Yeah, I think a lot of this speaks to kind of just the various moving parts here in every situation and how they can differ. But I mean, speaking of locked doors, I mean, we can look to Jackie's research with a host of other people about lockdowns. So yeah, there's a lot more to talk about, but unfortunately we're coming up on time here. So I'll give each of you maybe like 30 seconds for closing final thoughts, unless you all just want to agree on a definition now and we can move forward.
We agree, doesn't mean others will.
Yeah, just so final thoughts here, and then I'll offer some words and we'll go about our days. So Bill, if you want to start.
Yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity, and I think it's great for the field that this is what we're doing. We have three groups of panelists here and all approaching a very similar topic from very different perspectives, right? We have the idea of looking at trends, the idea of looking at prevention, and the idea of looking at response. All of those are extremely different, but extremely important in their own way, and can provide a great deal of information to the public, to practitioners, to academics, everyone. So while I have little hope that we will ever come to an absolute consensus on definitions, I think that as long as we're working towards better fitting the data to the definitions we're using and being really specific about that, we're moving in the right direction. Nobody in here had the exact same idea for a definition, but as long as your data is presented in that way and people understand it in that way, which I think is the biggest problem we have right now, is just a lack of understanding. So better educating everyone else out there.
That's great. Thanks, Bill. Jamie, if you want to go next.
Yeah, just two things. In terms of the idea that we'll never reach consensus, it's true even in the area of serial murder. I was involved with that big conference hosted by the FBI to try to define serial murder, where they decided to make the threshold 2 victims. I didn't agree with it at the time. I still don't agree with it, and I, like many other people, haven't followed it. So I'm not sure it's in the cards. I do want to congratulate you guys on the journal. It's very difficult starting a new journal. You may not know that in 1985 I was the founding editor of the Journal of Quantitative Criminology. It's tough to start a journal, and there's a lot of work, and you've done a great job.
We appreciate that. Thanks so much for participating. Emily, if you want to go next.
Sure. I think I agree we're probably not going to land on a definition like everyone else here, but I think it's okay to have different definitions. I think we're all sort of studying slightly different aspects of the phenomenon. Some of us are studying even different phenomena. So like mass killing is not the same thing as a mass shooting, and that's okay to have different ways of defining it in different thresholds. I think the key thing is being as clear as possible about how we're defining it, and hammering that into the media, because they're the ones who are going to be spreading misinformation. If they get it wrong, making sure they know they got it wrong, like right off the bat, so that there's not this continued spreading of misinformation and confusion. And I also think it's important to keep these kinds of conversations happening among scholars who are studying mass shootings. Too often, we all have our own databases and our own definitions, and we don't really talk to each other outside of these collaborations that we have put together. So, I think making sure that we're collaborating and talking to each other instead of competing or, disagreeing about these phenomenon or defining this phenomenon is really, really important. So I guess all that is to say is thank you for putting this together.
Thanks, Emily. And then Jay, if you want to close us out.
Sure. So expanding off what Emily said in terms of ensuring clarity, I think that was what ultimately we're all trying to do here. And what Emily and I tried to do with our paper was provide this very succinct way to ensure clarity. So we know to some degree in the media, they've caught on to the usage of the public mass shooting, breaking down the distinction between public, felony, and family. And so since we know that that has been able to catch on, at least to some degree, we're hoping now this will catch on in terms of the breakdown of completed, attempted, failed, and foiled. So when it's advertising, these high profile events and they're showing trend lines, we should focus on the completed public mass shootings, and using those abbreviated terms will really help clarify the problem over time, hopefully.
Great. Thank you. So we're just about over time. So thank you to all the panelists, to your co-authors of the articles, and all the reviewers for their time and their contributions. We know that everybody's busy, and it was a pretty tight turnaround for submissions, so we appreciate it. Thanks to Jackie for being our person to help run the show behind the scenes today and to help organize this. And we're grateful to SUNY Oswego for their support of the webinar and of this journal. This was recorded, so we'll be posting this on our website and social media to, you can view, you can share, and all the articles in the special issue are there too. We really hope that this discussion continues both in research articles and otherwise in person, perhaps. And we look forward to the continued success of the Journal of Mass Violence Research. So if anyone has any questions for the panelists, we'll provide their contact information on the website if they're okay with it. But thank you all for attending, and we hope you have a great week.
Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you.